Welcome again. I'm assuming there might be a couple people that were not on last night, and I wasn't in the check-in with everybody. I was in my own little check-in group. So I'm going to sort of introduce myself and my relationship to the ISC and social ecology, and kind of a little bit about my own political history. I'm Chaia Heller, and I've been part of the ISC for 36 years. I stumbled accidentally. It's a very strange story how I ended up at the ISC when I was 21 years old, and I never left. I became a teacher of ecofeminism. Actually, we called the class Feminism and Ecology for about 22 summers. And for the last, I think, 10 years of the ISC summer program, Dan and I co-taught a class that everybody took together that was kind of like the thing that glued everything together. That was a class that looked at the philosophy and politics of social ecology. And we also, Dan and I are both anthropologists. We both brought a lot of sort of anthropological materials and insights into the class. And so what I'm going to do here is kind of offer like literally a nutshell of what that class was. A little bit about my political history. I was a radical lesbian separatist feminist, lesbian from like age 16, which is significant because it was in the 70s. And I literally was a lesbian at a time when I thought literally somebody would kill me if they knew, or my parents would disown me if they knew. And they kind of actually did for about 15 years. In the 80s, I became a very active activist in the radical lesbian feminist movement. And at the same time, I was involved in social ecology, which was a mixed movement, excuse me, a multi-sex movement. At the time, it was weird. I was really straddling two really different worlds. During the 80s in particular, if you were a hardcore radical lesbian feminist, you didn't really organize in movements where there were men. And that was a really interesting thing to be part of, or movement to be part of, to be kind of straddling two different movements at the same time. So while I was in the feminist movement, really doing a lot of issues around women's reproductive rights and health, battling racism in our movement and outside our movement, I was also really involved at the same time in the Green movement, the Youth Green movement, the Left Greens, when we broke away from the Greens when they really wanted to go mainstream. I got involved. I was an anarchist, anarchist movements and organizations. I began writing and doing public speaking a lot in the 80s and 90s. And I was an activist, did a lot of street protests, organizing local actions. I was involved in a lot of different organizations, again, both in my little lesbian radical feminist bubble and in my kind of social ecology / anarchist bubble. They're big little bubbles. I was involved in the alter globalization movement. That really kind of made a big wave in Seattle at the Battle of Seattle '99. I was involved in Occupy and have been, attending a lot of BLM movement actions and marches more locally. In the last several years, I became kind of really interested in health activism and been focusing more on writing about kind of women's health, and in particular the problem of autoimmunity. I have two autoimmune disorders that made me have to stop teaching. I was teaching anthropology and gender studies until 7 years ago at Mount Holyoke College. And I've been working on a memoir that's kind of a political, feminist, queer look at why so many, particularly women and women of color, get misdiagnosed in our heteropatriarchal, racist medical system, and why we often are refused treatment, care, compassion, etc. I'm a lucky one. I finally did get diagnosis and treatment. But right now I feel unlucky because I got COVID 3 months ago and I'm still sick with it, which is made me really, I was politicized around COVID before I got COVID. I got sick on March 30, so I was aware of it since January. I knew it was coming. I knew I had a target on my back, and I knew that if it hit, this was going to be a complete race, class, feminist shit show, and it is. So that kind of brings me to where I am sitting before you, and I was sort of thinking about, like, where are we? This is where we are. We are at an intersection. There's a little arrow. We are here. We have Trump, and I'm definitely going to speak a lot from the US experience right now because that's where I'm located, and that doesn't mean at all that people can't bring in examples and experiences from outside the US, particularly in Q&A and breakouts. I would love that. We'd all love that. Trump, we've got a pandemic going on that's completely out of control and mismanaged. There's blood on a lot of people's hands. We don't even have to go into that because you all probably know way more, or at least as much as I do, about how this pandemic is being intentionally mishandled. We have the protests going on that were sparked by the murder of George Floyd, but are the culmination of at least 4 years of Black Lives Matter movement and people really doing heavy duty organizing behind the scenes. They have not gotten a lot of press coverage in the last years, and there's been this opening at this point when people are really freaking out and actually have time to do what were really kind of mass scale protests. Since Trump came to office, I've been asking myself and everybody I know, why is there not a general strike? And why don't people just do a walkout of their lives, their jobs, their everything? And the answer is that we have no safety net in this country. White people have no safety net, working class, underclass white people, and Black people know what happens if you go out and you start protesting without the support of white people. And we're seeing what happens when white people will show up. There's more safety to do that. I'm not saying BLM people have not been protesting, but I think to scale up on this way, it required white people to get out on the streets. And I think that the pandemic, this is not just my opinion, has created an opening for people, like white people with privilege, to get out in the streets and shine a light on this catastrophe. So we have Trump, the pandemic, protests, and white supremacy and heteropatriarchy as ideologies that are propping up all of these things. And what I'm hoping to do this morning is to really talk about the philosophical underpinnings that normalize the current reality that we're in, that normalize what is absolutely not normal or acceptable. It's normalizing evil. And Hannah Arendt wrote a lot about the banalization of evil, of how evil doings among Nazis literally became banalized everyday actions that people couldn't even really see or really resist mentally, because people became accustomed to doing horrible, murderous things to people over a set of days, weeks, years. And I think that's what's been happening in the United States for centuries. In the last, I think Trump has really helped just make things much more perverse and vulgar and disgusting, so that it's harder to not look at it. And so right now we're gonna look at it. What is this system, this epistemological, philosophical system that normalizes and banalizes the kind of unjust, I'm gonna say evil, it is evil, treatment of people of color, women, queer people across the LGBTQ spectrum, poor people, old people, people with disabilities, etc. There's no etc. It's just the 99%. Should not ever be the etc. So I'm going to try to start with the whole question of epistemology. I'm going to be drinking a lot of water, so you'll get used to my green cup. And I did a lot of study of philosophy in my life. I majored in philosophy in my undergraduate studies, and everybody who I studied was mostly a dead white man. And it was all what you'd call speculative philosophy. I loved it. It was sort of like mental math. I thought it was delicious and fun, but I also would sort of leave every visit that I'd have with the philosophers we'd study, that were mostly dead white men, and sort of have this question of, so what? This is really fun to think with, but I don't understand where it's relevant to the world. I accidentally ended up at the ISC in the summer of 1984 due to a best friend who was supposed to be working in the kitchen that summer as a work study, and she decided to work at the local health food store, so I got her spot. That's how I ended up there. Anyway, when I went to the ISC, I met a real live living white man who's had a very heavy Bronx Jewish kind of Yiddishy accent, and his name was Murray Bookchin, and I thought he was really old because he was 62, 4 years older than I am now, and to me he was like about to die. I was like, wow, he could be not only my father, grandfather, great-grandfather, he's so freaking old. And I laugh now because I'm almost there. And here was this guy teaching philosophy, but it completely spoke to everything, every question that I had about how our current social, political, ecological order worked. He explained the emergence of hierarchy and the state and capitalism. He made things make sense, and his work was grounded in philosophy. And the philosophy has many branches that I'm not putting here. There's branches of philosophy called ontology, which is the study of materiality. There's metaphysics. But here I'm going to talk about epistemology this morning, and then ethics and how they relate to social ecology. And tomorrow we'll go into politics. But these lay the ground for all of social ecology's politics. The reason this really matters is that what Trump is able to do and what the way the pandemic is mismanaged and the way the protesters are being portrayed as anarchy, low life, awful people, or which is, well, I'll go into this later, or as low lifes, or God forbid, angry Black activists. All of these narratives about the protests, about medicine, about the role of Trump and the rationalizations for why and how he's able to continue to do the kinds of things he does are undergirded by a series of epistemological formations that we're not consciously aware of, but when I mention them, you'll be like, oh yeah, of course I know that. So epistemology is simply an attempt to use reason to make your unconscious thoughts about how you think conscious. So we're all epistemologists. Anytime you think, wow, the way I was thinking about that was kind of effed up. If you ever have that thought, you had an epistemological moment. Or if you say, wow, the way I thought about that used to be like really off base. All the people right now, white folks who are getting out on the streets who are discovering systemic racism are having an epistemological watershed moment. Epistemology matters. It's about how we think about thinking. It's the branch of philosophy that says, how do we think about thinking? And it matters how we think, because Trump's power is grounded in an entire philosophy about white supremacy, about male dominance, about heteropatriarchy, and about hierarchy as natural and normal, as the state as an instance of hierarchy that is natural and normal, and about the military and the armies and police being natural, normal, and necessary. And those social ideas are grounded in a nature philosophy. There are two reasons that Bookchin became interested in ecological theory. Two. One was he noticed a looming ecological crisis in the 60s. Really in the late 50s, he started writing about the problems of chemicals in our food. Really, he was one of the first, if not the first, leftist to notice that there was a looming ecological crisis, that our water was getting contaminated, our air, the soil, species were being decimated, and he started to write about global warming If not before, at the same time that the other people who are famous for talking about that, but he was certainly the first leftist to talk about these issues. Before Bookchin, ecology was considered a very bourgeois affair. It was considered kind of a luxury boutique topic. It wasn't really considered central to the revolution as people defined the revolution, which was about the workers and the streets and factories. Ecology was kind of seen as tertiary, secondary, and bourgeois. Bookchin was interested in ecology for two reasons. One, he noticed a looming ecological crisis, and two, he knew that the way to get out of both our social problems, our political problems of hierarchy within humanity, to transcend those problems and to ward off the looming ecological crisis, we had to become conscious of how we think about what is humanity, what is nature, and what ought to be the relationship between humanity and nature. And I know that Dan talked last night. He's so gifted and articulate, so I'm not going to repeat too much of what Dan said. I was listening to a lot of it, but I will review some just quickly so that we can kind of start in the same base in case anybody's also joining this morning who wasn't here last night. So the first kind of prominent way people think about society and nature, that's the most, definitely the most ascendant, received, hegemonic, dominant way of thinking about nature and society, is that society as a generalized category dominates and rationalizes or masters nature. And a lot of people who work for the WTO, the International Monetary Fund, the people who fund development projects all over the world, development, a lot of post-colonial projects, etc., depends on this framing device, this idea that human beings have this inherent, necessary, inevitable ability and destiny to rationalize, master the natural world and to make it improve our lives. That's why the developing world's called it's developing, because it wasn't developed before. You know, Bonds and Shiva in the 80s wrote a lot about maldevelopment, which is a really wonderful corrective to the term development. But Bookchin said this idea that society dominates nature is not only inaccurate, but it's really problematic because it normalizes our entire social political order. First of all, the reason Bookchin says that society can't dominate nature is because society and nature, that society, humanity emerges in natural evolution with, in nature. So the way that you can't dominate your own arm, you could chop it off, but that would be self-destructiveness. You can't dominate your own foot. You can chop it off, and that would be self-destructiveness, but you cannot dominate nature. The idea of domination requires two subjectivities or more, where one subjectivity that's human can actually dominate and rule over and master the subjectivity of another human being. That is domination. Human beings dominate and create hierarchies among themselves. Animals don't do that. It doesn't happen in what we call nature, that is the nature that precedes the emergence of human beings. And what's also really problematic with this heuristic or this framing device of society over nature is it imagines that society is one category, that humanity is one category. But as we know from the whole heuristic of the 1% and the 99%, when 99% of humanity has no control over the decisions that are immiserating most of humanity and destroying the natural world, that's not society, is it? It's actually, this should be 1% of society dominates society and nature. That's really what that's the more accurate depiction of what's actually going on right now. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's 1% of society that is white men on the planet who control and own most of the wealth derived from the natural world, along with most of society. Because here I said, who is society? So the idea of anti-humanism, people who say that, you know, all we need to do is get rid of human beings and we'll be good. That's a very racist and sexist thing to say, and heterosexist, heteropatriarchal thing to say. In the 80s, there were people who said that the AIDS virus was a gift because it was going to reduce the population on the planet, and that was Gaia's way of restoring balance for the planet's carrying capacity. And as a queer person in the 80s, and I was very involved in a very early chapter of ACT UP in Vermont in 1980, God, I think 5, might have been 87. We were furious when this came out because basically they were saying that queer bodies didn't matter. And they were saying that people of color didn't matter because the vast majority of the people on the planet who were going to get this plague were going to be mostly women of color at the end of the day in the global south, and queer people and IV drug users in all over the world. And it was saying those people's lives do not count as part of humanity, and that they can be just brushed away as part of nature. Nature's just cleansing herself of this garbagey part of humanity. It was extremely racist in classes. And there are even people today, at the beginning of the pandemic, I haven't seen it so much recently, where people were saying, oh, the pandemic's actually great because it's, you know, we're using less fossil fuel now. And maybe this is a corrective, you know, order that we really, really needed. And I was furious as somebody who has, you know, chronic illnesses. I knew that if I got this thing, it could take me down or make me very ill, which it has. And I know that Black and brown people who have exponentially higher health problems and exponentially higher bad health outcomes from terrible disease and illness in this country, we're going to be completely overrepresented. And there would be the excess deaths would be mostly Black and brown people, old people, sick people, etc. So this kind of thinking is still very popular. It blew my mind, even on radical, like ecology people, they were running this around. That the plague was, the pandemic, corona was actually a good thing. And when they think that's a good thing, what they're saying is, some people are saying, I think nature needs to dominate society now. That's what we need to do, just flip the dualism, and let's just let nature take its course. And the problem with this is that there's no such thing at this point of a nature that's pre-social or separable from the social. Every inch, every molecule of this planet has been mapped and licensed and patented and owned and surveyed. And that means that everything that we think of as being natural has been thoroughly absorbed into a political, capitalist, racist, heteropatriarchal system. So there is really no nature that can take its course now. And then even if it did, it would disproportionately kill people of color. And we saw with Katrina, and we've seen with every natural disaster, which are obviously climate crises, people who are poor and of color are disproportionately hit all over the world, obviously not just in this country. Some people try to say, well, let's solve that dualism by saying nature and society are the same thing. They're one and again, and the same. The problem with that monistic approach is, which says that everything has intrinsic value and we should have a biodemocracy. This was very popular in the 80s. The problem with this is, again, it doesn't explain to us who is in society that has control politically to make any decisions about nature, and what people in society are considered actually closer to nature. And I'll sort of take a moment just to say that historically, the problem with the word nature and societies being separate is that dualism rests on assumption that there are some people that are closer to nature than others. And it's not necessarily good. That women are seen as closer to nature than men by a lot of people, mostly, well, no, I would say, you know, when I taught gender studies, I would always start the class by saying, are women closer to nature? And, you know, so many hands would go up. And we would have this discussion about that. And they would answer it's because women they menstruate and they engage in childbirth and reproduction. And we'd sort of break that down and we'd say, why did those biological functions seem to be, I'm sorry, that's my bougie labradoodle wanting to go out. Alan, can you let Mazel out? The beauties of Zoom. I might have to let him out if he keeps barking. Sorry, I just got distracted. I was saying-
Women being closer to nature.
Yeah. So this idea that women are closer to nature, what happens then is people who are Black and brown are also somehow mysteriously closer to nature as well, because they were slaves and they worked in the soil and they were 3/5 human until really, you know, quite recently in American history. I'm so sorry, I'm gonna let my labradoodle out. Oh. I'm alone in my house, so if he barks to come back in, I'll have to stop again. I'm really sorry. So suddenly Black and brown people are closer to nature as well. And that goes right into racist history where slaves were considered 3/5 human. And that idea carries forth today with the depictions of Black men who are unarmed, who are being murdered by police, that when they start saying, well, they have a criminal history or they have a history with drug addiction, they're basically saying they're not really human beings. They're sort of wild, violent animals. And this portrayal or this understanding that Black men and women are animals and wild is very, very ingrained in our dominant nature philosophy. And that white men have to, it's the white man's burden, has to really control things. Donald Trump, when he says, I'm gonna dominate the streets, he's saying, I'm gonna dominate sort of the natural animality of these wild protesters who are irrational, and I have to keep law and order over them. He's literally, this is not a new narrative. This goes, you know, back literally centuries that has brought us this awful narrative. So Black people are closer to nature, brown people, women, queer people are closer to nature too, because there's something, they're kind of nature gone awry. I'll say, you know, I used to sort of talk about all the different ways that people can be closer to nature. One of the ways is to be considered to be unnatural. That if you're an abnormality, that's an unnatural body, and that could be a lesbian, gay, bi, trans, agender person, the assumption is that you're not fully human. You know, you're not fully a normative human being who's participating in a rational discourse in rational civil society. You are to be dominated along with nature. So again, I think I've made a case for why Bookchin felt like this dualism, whether you flip it or not, is not useful if we want to get an accurate and actually liberatory, emancipatory understanding of what is humanity really, what is nature really, and what's the relationship potentially between the two. And you know, during the pandemic, I want to remind folks that health, you know, by womanist, feminist Audre Lorde, who if you haven't read her work, please do yourself the great service of reading Audre Lorde. She wrote the cancer journals in the 80s, and she had breast cancer and she died of breast cancer. And she really was one of the first feminists to really write about how political medical issues are, and how political medicine is, and how political science is, and how political illness is, and disease. And she wrote about being a Black lesbian and how her cancer, generationally in her family, was absolutely a political issue. So this pandemic, I know you all know that it's a political issue. It's also an ecological issue, because our bodies, as I'm going to argue, are part of the natural order, or the natural sort of order of things. And if our bodies are being contaminated by not just a virus, that's not what's killing everybody, but racist and classist and statist policies or non-policies that are creating so many excess deaths, that's an ecological problem. So I see the pandemic through an ecological as well as political lens. So to get back to nature and society, if you don't have a dualism, what are you going to have? You can have a dialectical relationship between the two categories, where you have nature that begins for Bookchin. I mean, the Earth has been around for 300 billion years or more, but Bookchin became really interested in talking about organic nature, which began with the first single cellular organism in the oceans that emerged in the oceans. And I'm using a spiral to show a developmental continuum that gradually gives a rise to, we're Homo sapiens sapiens. We are all, 99% alike genetically. We are one species. There's no subspecies or subraces. That is a myth, and that's a whole other discussion that I would love to talk about, but not right now. And that this historical process that goes between the first unicellular organism and the emergence of human beings takes millions of years. And the reason Bookchin thought this was important to look at is because if you can't look at the emergence, the gradual emergence of consciousness, and he's really into the word, if you read social ecology, these three words will come out: consciousness, freedom, and subjectivity. If you can't give an ecology history to the idea of freedom, you have nothing bigger than yourself to ground your demand for freedom on. You need to, he believes you need to be able to ground the idea of freedom in something bigger than yourself. And what he wanted to do was provide a natural history for the idea of freedom. That's why the book is called The Ecology of Freedom. And in the book, The Ecology of Freedom, he tries to show the emergence of hierarchy, but he also tries to show that through natural history, we see the gradual emergence of subjectivity. And what subjectivity means simply is the emergence of organic life that has a nascent degree of subjectivity, which means that you cannot predict the way you can with an algorithm or with a physics formula, which way a unicellular organism is going to move or shift or organize itself, the way you can a computer. Does that make sense? The fact that a unicellular, and if you move kind of along in the timeline of organic life as it begins to unfold, and you start to see the emergence of multicellular organisms, the slow emergence of a vertebrae, of a brain, a nervous system, the more complex these structures become, the more subjectivity the organism acquires or attains. And by this, I mean, you can take an ant, and if you take an ant on a piece of paper and you want to say, I know which direction this ant's going to move, you can't. Why? Because that ant has a nascent degree of subjectivity. The ant might actually stand there and not move at all. It might just die. It might go to sleep. It might be stunned. It might run off your paper entirely. It might zigzag around your paper. You don't know. That is because it has a nascent degree of freedom, consciousness, subjectivity. Is it the same kind of subjectivity and freedom and consciousness that we have right now? No, it's different. There's a developmental continuum, and Bookchin said it's non-hierarchical, and it moves gradually. And for Bookchin, you have the emergence of smaller mammals. I don't like the word higher mammals, later mammals, let's say. There's earlier mammals, later mammals. I love all primates. I love primates and citations, all of them. I love elephants. I think I'd love to know what their lives are really like. I'm sure they'd have a lot to say about a lot of things. At some point, we do see the emergence of humanity. And the reason that social ecology is particularly interested in humanity is because 1% of humanity is destroying the planet and immiserating the 99%. So humans thinking about humans is not human-centric. It's that humans have got, the 99% has got to figure out how to liberate ourselves from the 1%, and we have to figure out how to save the rest of the natural world so that we don't all go down in misery. So humanity matters. That's why he wants to see the gradual emergence of nature, of humanity. And basically for Bookchin, he says there is a first nature, which is all of natural history up until the emergence of humanity. And then second nature includes human beings and everything that human beings touch and modify and engage with. So second nature is human culture, it's human society, and it's all everything that human beings work, produce, and interact with. So I was going to talk about, had some visuals. This is nature. It's a rock. Rocks, I think, could be 300 billion years old. This is a pine. It's a conifer plant. Conifers have been around, I think, for 300 million years. My partner is a biological anthropologist, and I wrote it down in words. But I think that conifers are around 300 million years old. This is nature too. This is nature. This is a Russian sage that I have growing in my garden. That is a domesticated plant that derives from a wild species of sage from the desert. I do not live in the desert. This is not indigenous to where I live in Western Massachusetts. This is probably, I'm going to guess, roughly this variety, probably less than 60 years old. I'm sure that they've been playing with this variety for many years, but I bet this is a relatively recent thing. Here's an apple. This is nature, but it's this is second nature. So I forgot to say, so this would be first nature, right? But the fact that we let this tree stand in our yard when we moved in, and that somebody planted this makes it second nature. Does that make sense? So second nature retains first nature, but adds second nature onto it. So this is a conifer that's, its derivation is older than second nature, but this instance of this conifer is an instance of second nature because a human being planted this, I assume, in our yard. I might be wrong. I don't know what the property looked like or what the land looked like when Native American people lived where I live now. The apple is second nature. There were probably I know there were teeny weeny little apple-like things that were domesticated over centuries to become this big, monstrous, juicy fruit. But it's also a product of agribusiness, which is insane. And then the question is this nature? This is applesauce in a plastic case. And the reason we have these is because when I was really sick with COVID, I was eating out of all plastic because I was in quarantine, and we would never have gotten this kind of space food in my house because it's really wasteful and disgusting, but I happened to have it lying around, so I thought I'd use a visual aid. But this is the ultimate instance of second nature for me, where there is an apple in there that has its roots in pre-social trees that might have preceded the emergence of humanity from little teeny apple-like things, and we made it into this, and then we made it into that. This kind of thing happened more in like the 50s, 60s, 70s. This has been going on for centuries. So, okay. So basically what Bookchin does by saying that there's first and second nature, he basically makes the idea of nature as a separate category go away. There's no more dualism. It's a developmental continuum that's dialectical. Dialectical meaning, dialectic simply means the examination of any opposing categories, usually two opposing categories. It's an examination of their properties, examination of their relationship. It's an attempt to understand the relationship between two opposing contradictory categories. In this case for Bookchin, the categories are nature and society. And so he ecologizes the dialectic that Hegel first created. That was not a nature or society, it was different. I would love to do a whole class on that, but I won't. And he ecologizes Marxist dialectic that was called dialectical materialism. Bookchin's theory is called dialectical naturalism. For Marx, the emergence of society does not emerge out of a spiral. It's more like the dualism. For Marxist dialectical materialism, it was over time humanity being increasingly able to master and rationalize and dominate nature to make it productive for humanity. And Bookchin really didn't, again, he was not interested in perpetuating that dualistic view of nature. He went for a dialectical view where what's very important here is that later phases of the development incorporate earlier phases of the development. So the potential for subjectivity that you see in a unicellular organism, nascent subjectivity, you see in the Homo sapiens sapien, in the elephant, in the dolphin, in the whale, in other primate species. I'm gonna do one more chunk and then take some Q&A. So for Bookchin, he became really interested in looking at that movement from nature, first nature to second nature, to understand what is the logic. Is there a developmental logic as we're thinking through that developmental process that holds it all together? And for Bookchin, there was a logic of development that was somewhere between random change. Random change is something you see in physics. You also see it actually in organic life too, and predetermined natural law. We live in an era right now where most social phenomena and natural phenomena are considered to be the result of determined natural law. Trump really believes that he is biologically was determined superior because of his genetics. His father was a big eugenics guy. His family has history involved in loving eugenics. It's really creepy. For people who don't know what eugenics is, is still a science that tries to use genetic science to improve the human species. And what that what that means is that white people of a certain ilk are genetically designed to be better than everybody else. The Nazis used American born eugenics to rationalize the mass extermination of Jews because Jews were genetically inferior. And he would have loved to, I'm sure, have murdered. If he had gotten to the United States, he would have probably just enslaved Black people. Not just enslaved, would have put slavery back in action, which Trump would probably love to do as well. So Bookchin was interested in how do we get away from this notion that nature and social events are predetermined or deterministic by natural law, but not fall into the trap of saying they're just the result of chaotic random change. A random chaotic change is a mutation that happens within your body, within a plant, etc. We can't say that all natural and social events are just random change because it gives us no logic for how evolution happens. It gives us no logic for how within society any kind of progress happens. Like today, what's happening in the streets isn't just random social change. It didn't just come out of nowhere. There's a logic there, but it wasn't predetermined either. If you have an oak tree, it's not going to randomly produce grapefruits, right? It's going to produce acorns, and that's not just because it's random, and it's not just because it's biologically determined to do that. An oak tree could produce acorns, or it could produce acorns that the acorn is not a random event in that it won't necessarily become an oak tree. I'm kind of flipping I'm going to focus on the acorn before I go to the edge. If you have an acorn, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. It couldn't have been a bicycle coming out of an oak tree. It's an acorn There's a developmental logic that's structural and biological inherent within the acorn that gives it the potential to give rise to an oak tree. But the acorn could just lie on the ground and rot. It could be eaten by a squirrel, or it could do a myriad of other things. Somebody just step on it when they walk by. The acorn is not randomly going to turn into a bicycle, but it's not inevitably determined to become an oak tree. Does that make sense? It's a weird but really important idea. That if somebody here has a baby, it's not random that's going to turn into an adult human being. It's not going to turn into a bicycle. It's not going to turn into, a chimpanzee if you have a human baby. But it's also not inherently going to become an adult. It could become ill, it could die. And it's certainly not inherently determined it's going to become if it's a straight child, cisgender child. When people have, when I was pregnant with my daughter, I was very aware. People would say, "What are you having?" Because, you could have the ultrasound that tells you. And I'd be like, "I don't know." And they say, "Oh, you didn't check your, the ultrasound?" I said, "No, I checked. We know the sex of the baby." And they said, "Well, then, so you do know." I say, "I do know, but I don't know what the sex of my kid is going to be, or gender they're going to, you can be born with XX chromosomes, as I'm sure we all know, and have a completely different sex identity and gender identity. So you could be born female, and it's not determined that you're going to be cisgender or identify as female, and the same if you're born male. It's not certain at all if you're going to become cisgender male or male identified. But it's not so random that the baby's going to be turned into a bicycle. So Bookchin was interested in, if we don't want to go to deterministic philosophies of nature that really normalize authoritarian social institutions, and we don't want to go towards kind of what post-structuralism did and postmodernism did in the academy, which made everything relativistic and everything's random and you can't really explain anything, then you have to find some other way to understand this dialectic. And what Bookchin said, if you want to get between random change and deterministic philosophy where natural law reigns, you have to ground organic instances of natural evolution as possessing a potential developmental logic. And that each of us right now, we embody a developmental structural logic. That if you cut your finger, it's not going to randomly, turn into a zipper and zip itself back up. There's a logic to how that is going to either get infected or whether it's going to heal, right? There's an organic logic there to how something that's organic or biological manages itself. It's neither random nor deterministic. If you have no health care and you get gashed open and you can't afford to go get stitches, you're probably going to get an infection. If you live in Bombay or in a favela in Rio de Janeiro and you have no health services, you could die if you get a really bad cut that requires stitches. In North America, it's a little different. In the United States, you could still totally die because you can't get stitches. So it's not just a random thing that's going to happen but there's a developmental potential organic organizing logic within organic beings that's really central to Bookchin's philosophy. And I'm going to sort of wrap up this piece about epistemology by saying, the meaning that Bookchin has in his dialectical naturalism, he seeks to transcend the dualistic view of nature that tends to reproduce and normalize racist and heteropatriarchal and classist ideologies. And he wants to get rid of deterministic thinking that also rationalizes racist and heteropatriarchal and classist orders and systems. Okay, now the dog wants to come back in. So breathe for a moment and I'll let him back in. See, my dog as an instance of nature is unpredictable. He might have laid out there all day looking around for cats, but he didn't. So I thought we could take a moment and do some, maybe 10 minutes of questions and then do breakouts and then come back for report backs. And tomorrow I'll do a very short piece of how ethics fits in, and we'll do politics. Should we do comments and questions for, say, 10, 15? And then breakouts for like 20? Is that a good? Okay, cool. And all of your questions help me to remember the things that I didn't say. So everything you say, it's like a puzzle. I'm putting the pieces out. All of your questions is another piece that goes back into the puzzle. And they're all necessary pieces. And I encourage you to disagree with the theory, question it, offer a counter position, any and all.
Okay, so yeah, we actually did have a couple questions come in. There was a kind of active chat going while you were presenting, Chaia. So I think the first one that I saw was from Maxilin, is subjectivity agency? And I don't know if you want to unmute and expand on that question at all, Maxilin, or if you would like Chaia to just take that one. And then we'll take stack, if you can use the raise hand feature or put your question in the chat or just say stack in the chat and then unmute yourself when we get to you.
Should I just answer?
Still muted, Maxilin. We still can't hear you.
Do they want to answer or do they want me to answer? I can't see.
We can't hear you. So Chaia, why don't you take the question as it was posed in the chat, and then if you want to add any clarifying questions or your mic starts working later, Maxilin, we can come back to you.
So when you study any philosopher, you'll notice that they have their own lexicon, their own vocabulary that has its own internal logic that's really particular to that philosophy. So for Bookchin, the terms subjectivity, agency, freedom, consciousness often they're kind of coterminous terms. So Bookchin would say, yes, when you look through the emergence of humanity within nature, you see increasing levels of agency. The fact that organisms become increasingly able to participate in their own development, that they become increasingly innovative. An example is that there's many animals that will go into grassy land. You ever seen your dog turn around 3 times before they sit down? That's sort of genetically built into them by species learning that if they could make a little pad for themselves in the grass, they could see around themselves and be safer. So that is a way in which many, many animals, not just dogs, wolves, a lot of other animals will literally modify the environment, pat it down to line it. That is a kind of not just adapting to their environment, but modifying the environment to benefit themselves. That we see as we go through natural evolution, organisms, animals being increasingly able to either adapt to or modify their environments. And that is a kind of nascent agency. That is the prequel to people deciding to have agency to, I want to come here this morning and sit and look at all these boxes and think about philosophical ideas that hopefully have relevance. So yes, Bookchin would say the term agency would be coterminous with consciousness, freedom, subjectivity, and that all of those things become increasingly complex and increasingly robust, and so that the subjectivity of a human being and the subjectivity of a dog are really different. Doesn't mean that dogs are any less important or lovely. It's different. Human beings can really think about thinking in a way that dogs, for instance, cannot. But Bookchin said you have to understand, if we can't anchor the origins of agency, human freedom, the impulse towards freedom in our own natural history, then where do we anchor it? It has to begin somewhere. Christians and Jews and in Islam, it's the Genesis flash of God making the world in 7 days and, making Adam and Eve like that. If you don't have God doing it, then it has to happen in some other way. And Bookchin says it happens slowly, incrementally over time throughout natural evolution.
Phil T, do you want to unmute yourself to ask a question? Oh, sorry. Thanks, Blair. I guess we have a few other folks on stack as well. But Phil, why don't you go ahead, and then after that we'll do Joseph, Jeff, Cam, Apurva.
Thank you. Hi. Good morning, everyone. I'm Phil from the Philippines. I wasn't here yesterday, but thank you for the very, very good and enriching lecture. There's actually a lot of topics that were covered in that lecture. But first, I would like, I only have one question because I also studied philosophy. My undergraduate was philosophy. I'm taking a graduate course in conflict studies right now. And so I understand the idea of, the becoming, basically, where we differentiate, how should I say this, the deterministic via the natural order, and the one that has the subjectivity where perhaps the individual has the control. I would suppose so. And I think my question is, given the context of the that you pose of society over nature, having society trying to dominate nature, I will go back to becoming with the existing or current pandemic we have. What does it mean of our becoming as a society in that regard? Considering that the pandemic has, as we know, further polarized the existing crisis we have, whether that is let's say, for example, the Black Lives Matter, instead of putting more focus, for example, on health policies that could be perhaps targeted to them, but of course with the current what do you call this, violence ongoing, it could further polarize them from I don't know, perhaps more affirmative public policy actions or health policies that could be forwarded or targeted to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question and comment. It's really very rich and helpful. Absolutely. So the reason, I'm going to reiterate, Bookchin is interested in the natural history of freedom is because he believed we have to understand where it comes from, and ultimately human beings have to consciously formalize freedom. And when we talk tomorrow about politics, we're looking at the forms of freedom. Bookchin believed that if you don't formalize freedom in horizontal, we call it now, non-hierarchical institutions, we will not have freedom. The reason we're having such catastrophe with this pandemic is because the people, the 99%, do not have formalized, free institutions that have our health and well-being as the priority. But we have forms of unfreedom. Literally, we are living surrounded by forms of unfreedom. And we are living in, all of us are here are living in a state. The state is about 6,000 years old. It's very recent emergence in the history of human beings. We're around as a species, give or take 150,000 years. The state is 6,000 years old. Capitalism just showed up about 500 years ago, like that in the evolutionary kind of timeline. So we're looking at we are being immiserated by forms of unfreedom or forms of oppression that counter this evolutionary trend towards increasing freedom. So basically, the state that is mismanaging in an evil way a pandemic, allowing it's going to be hundreds of thousands of people in the US and globally who are going to die because of state policies because of capitalism, and because of ideologies of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy, because of all of that, we have formalized oppression, and we need to counter that by creating a politics that's grounded in an ecological and humane bioethics, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Unless we formalize, people keep saying with the protest, what will this come to? And people are really saying, will there be policy? And the most people can hope for is reforming the state policy. That's like the maximum vision people have right now on the streets. And not saying that the activists don't have greater aspirations, but that's the messaging that's coming forth mostly from the streets. And social ecology would say, we have to go further. We really have to come into our freedom, both understanding the history of our freedom, where it comes from, within natural history, within human history, and we have to create our own directly democratic institutions that are non-capitalist and ecological and are socially just, socially, that build social freedoms. Absolutely. Did that speak to what you just asked?
Thank you.
Joseph?
Can I suggest that we take a few questions, because if all the answers go that long, we won't get to the end.
I can do shorter responses too.
Or we could, yeah, let's just take a few and then you can kind of, weave together some responses. So Joseph, Joseph, raise yours.
Thanks. Yes, I have a question. This came up actually last night when Dan was talking, but I'll kind of give it again. So this is kind of more of a general philosophical question, but it seems like if you're using Darwinian epistemologies to inform normative ethical claims, to me that seems like it would imply that there is variation then inherently in your normative ethical claims. How do you choose? Like, how do you deal with that? What do you choose then if there's different things? And that's not just in like social ecology, but like whenever anyone uses Darwinian kind of claims to justify what you ought to do, that seems like it's a problem that comes up.
Yeah. That's a big one. Do you want me to answer that one, or do you want to take another one too?
Let's take a couple just so that we have them, and then if you want to answer one by one, up to you. Jeff?
Yeah, I just when you're talking about deterministic and random and the balance in between or whatever, I kind of thought of Masanobu Fukuoka's idea that nature appears random and there may be something deterministic or underlying there, but we don't have the capacity as human beings to understand it. So it's not even worth kind of going to that point or trying to understand it the way you would a mathematical equation or whatever. That even if there's even if everything is predetermined, the fact that we can't understand it means that doesn't matter to how we do science or look at the world. And I was just wondering if me tying those things together is kind of on the right track or whatever.
Let me just address those two really. I'll try to do it briefly as I can. Bookchin's not saying that there is nothing random in natural history or in reality. He would say, in fact, randomness is part of nascent freedom and spontaneity, that there is some stochasticity at play. There is some, again, spontaneity. There are completely unpredictable, and there is that randomness is a really important element to any organic or pre-organic event. What he was trying to emphasize is that simply opting to say, well, everything's random and everything's kind of relative, in particular saying that there's really no, particularly within human history, there's no arc of emancipation or liberation or progress of social ideas or ideals, that really change just kind of happens in a haphazard way. And, you know, you just try to create a spontaneous temporary autonomous zone, see what happens. He was kind of critical of that kind of almost glorification or reification of randomness as kind of a principle and as a way to shy away from maybe trying to find some kind of order or a logic that could be actually identifiable and meaningful to people who want to create a free society. That Bookchin said you have to be able to distinguish between something that's good and bad, and you have to have some sort of logic that drives you from something bad to something better, and that logic can't just be built on randomness. Back to the first question, it's really a question about sociobiology. That is usually the first question or comment people make when they hear Bookchin's ideas of dialectical naturalism. Anytime, I mean, it's a very treacherous thing to try to make a philosophy, to breach a political philosophy or to ground it in any way in any kind of natural order of any kind. It's you know, and social Darwinism is a really great example of how to do that really poorly. First of all, I want to say that Darwin, his work is not the same thing as social Darwinism. That was really largely created and promoted by Herbert Spencer, who was a propagandist of science. He was not actually a scientist. Darwin was actually a little bit more dialectical than people give him credit for. He actually wrote about tendencies in natural evolution, particularly in natural evolution, looking at species participating in both mutualistic, complementary kinds of behaviors as well as competitive ones. He really saw both trends. Interestingly, an anarchist zoologist named Kropotkin, who Bookchin never read, which is fascinating. Bookchin developed his ideas of dialectical naturalism before he read Peter Kropotkin. Read his book, Mutual Aid, it'll kind of blow your freaking mind. He basically wrote, he was looking at, if you read the book, you know, across so many different species, insects, you know, horses, that mutual aid, he decided at the end was absolutely empirically, he wasn't just cherry picking. He said this is an undeniable pattern that mutual aid and cooperation within species is a much more prominent trend than is competition and sort of mutual decimation. And Bookchin really was interested in primates and how primates are very social animals, and that without being a band together, working together, primates can't survive. A primate cannot go off by itself and make it, you know, be independent. I'm gonna go off on myself. Primate, an ape, can't, basically being ousted from a group, whether you're an ape or a human being, for most of human history, that meant death. And among human beings, the earliest human beings could not survive, again, without being a group, because human baby has a very protracted maturation period that takes almost really 4 years for them to be even remotely independent of the mother or the parent's care. If they're nursing that period, so that there had to be a mutual aid kind of ethos in the band of people, Homo sapiens sapiens, the earliest ones, to hold that mother baby duo, and to hold that, contain that, promote that. That was essential to our survival. So those are not just cherry-picked sociobiological principles. The important thing is that social Darwinism is deterministic. It doesn't talk about that, you know, that the theories like that are usually used to normalize kind of antisocial, awful behaviors, to be really honest, and to show that they are inherently either genetically inborn and you can't and they're put out as if they cannot be transcended. They're made of iron. That according to social Darwinism, human beings are inherently greedy, competitive, aggressive, men dominate over women, and this carries over into eugenic thinking. This carries over into a lot of thinking that is so popular today. I mean, the guy, Charles Murray, who wrote The Bell Curve in the freaking 90s, came out with a new book that's gotten a lot of traction. Sociobiology that's racist, that's very deterministic, is very popular. Bookchin was really, part of his project was really to take down and to challenge sociobiology and come up with a different read of nature. He said, you can't just walk away and say that nature and natural history isn't relevant to how we think about who we are and our place in the bigger natural order. You have to do it. The question is, how do you do a reading of the relationship between human history and natural history, historically and now? How do you do that in a way that is both accurate and emancipatory? And that was Bookchin's project. So I could give you a whole list of how dialectical naturalism is very different than social Darwinism. And the main piece is that he is not espousing a deterministic framework. Bookchin does not think that human beings are inherently anything. He was so clear, we are not inherently mutualistic, we are not inherently good, we're not inherently cooperative. Human beings can do horrible things, we're living that. He thought that we have the potential to be mutualistic and cooperative, and that logic brought us into being as a species. Obviously that logic has become overridden by our other proclivities to be aggressive and antisocial, and those have become locked in, and he wants to lock in forms of freedom instead. He saw this as entirely a choice for humanity to figure out who are we, what are our sets of potentialities, and how do we give them a form, an institutional form. I might not solve, this is a very long conversation, and I'd be happy if at some point over the next few days people want to have a breakout over this. I'd be happy to talk about social Darwinism, sociobiology, and dialectical naturalism. It's a really rich, messy, fun, interesting, weird conversation.
Yeah, I think we originally didn't have plans to do topical breakouts because it takes a little longer to sort people. But if we got into, if based on the themes that have emerged today, if we wanted to have people submit if we wanted to lay out a few breakout topics for tomorrow and have people say ahead of time, then we could pretty easily sort people ahead of time and do things that way. We only have 40 minutes left and we want to give ample time for breakouts. So let's just do a couple, let's take the last few questions and then maybe you can do one more response, Chaia, and kind of go through them. Cam?
Yes. You were talking a little bit about this. My question also focuses on the dialectic between spontaneity and natural law. And my question is, how do we decolonize our approach to thinking about the natural law side of it? And I hesitate to even use the phrase law. I feel like it's kind of a colonial import, and linguistically speaking. So yeah, I was just wondering what your posture is to try to decolonize our attitudes towards natural history in this way.
I love the term decolonize that you're using.
Hi, let's take the last couple. But great question, Cam. Apurva?
Yes, hi. So I sort of want to ask the question also around like the dialectic relationship between random change and change determined by natural law. So I'm wondering, how does knowledge factor into this? Is there, considering that you used one of the examples, which was that if you say injure yourself or sever a finger or whatever, but you can't seek medical help, then you know it's going to get infected. So in that sense, how does knowledge factor in that? Is there inherent knowledge? Is there knowledge that is learned? because this sort of knowledge that, oh, I don't have access to adequate healthcare where I am, and therefore when I injure myself, I'm not going to automatically get better, or there's a potential of getting infected. That seems more like learned knowledge as opposed to inherent knowledge. So just how that factors in here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then just for brevity's sake, I'm just going to read quickly because there were a couple questions exchanges in the chat. Malik Kawa, I think that's you, MP 2510, said, how do we account for intelligence? And you've kind of maybe talked about this a little bit high already, but how do we account for intelligence and the idea of evolution in an attempt to account for human intelligence among other species that are part of the evolving reality? And I believe it was Lemmy replied to that saying, yeah, from what I've read, dolphins are pretty much like us in terms of being able to think of themselves and their actions, among other things. Where do they fit in this framework? So those are kind of two questions about that. And then a question about whether Bookchin's concept of free nature is a response to the metabolic rift. And then a question, which I believe may have been answered in the chat, about whether social ecology has explored or dialogued with complexity theory. So maybe you don't have to answer all of those, because I think we should go to breakouts in the next like 2 or 3 minutes, but maybe pick a couple and then we can talk about them during breakouts too.
I'll try to they're all kind of related actually. The one about spontaneity and natural law and decolonizing our minds. I love the term decolonizing our minds because it really was during the colonial period that a lot of, and during the period of slavery, and which is part of the colonial period, that these ideas really got locked in the most kind of grotesque way, where literally it was natural law for enslaved Africans to remain enslaved. That was the natural received order that should remain in place. And the fights right now about the Confederate statues and flags that are so obscene, those fights are because those people feel that their natural right, they're as white people and with their white history, they have a naturally, they inherited that. And that it is unnatural, it's going against the natural order to take those things down. So I do believe that, again, Bookchin is trying to find what is that still point between spontaneity or randomness or chaos and natural law. And he would say that sweet spot is a logic of developmental order that has a trend towards increasing levels of agency, consciousness, freedom, subjectivity. And that if we can, again, formalize freedom by creating political, economic, social, cultural structures, we will thrive as a species, and we will not destroy the planet. If we don't, we will not. And to go to the next person about the issue of knowledge, again, part of building forms of freedom is building, is building an educational culture that, Bookchin said that every revolution is an educational project, that people build knowledge, new forms of knowledge as they live their lives as they're conscious of their oppression, conscious of the potential avenues for liberation. And so it's within liberation movements that people build knowledge, and then again they have to formalize that knowledge by creating institutions. In terms of like BLM, for instance, so much of the knowledge that people are bringing to the streets comes from the Black church. The Black church, was the one institution that slaves were allowed to have, where they could actually speak about things like freedom in a metaphorical sense, but they were really talking about in their literal sense. And the only exit out was to die and go to heaven. But the Black church is a production site for knowledge about freedom. And the streets right now are a site of knowledge production about how do we enact our freedom, become conscious of our freedom, and hopefully, again, social ecology says, let's go a step further and formalize that freedom by making it political, creating political structures that are outside of the state, outside of capitalism, that will actually be enduring. So we don't keep having to reform the same wheel again and again, reinvent, reform the same wheel. The two other ones, I mean, the thing about higher, I hate the term higher mammals, but other mammals and their intelligence, as an anthropologist, anthropologists are fascinated by this. There's primatology is a sub-discipline within anthropology, and the issue is communication. If we can't communicate with other mammals that are potentially very much like us, it's hard. I think what we have to do is respect all life, first of all, and have a lot of respect, particularly for our sentient, brothers and sisters. I mean, it's how I feel. I do feel that that elephants should not be clearly poached, and primates. I mean, when I see it, I feel like it's an atrocity. So I'm not, I personally do not sit in a typical animal rights framework, but I think that if we develop an ecological ethics, part of that ethics is not only caring for human beings, but caring for the rest of the natural world, and being sensitive, especially to other primates and cetaceans that are, and elephants, who are obviously thinking and highly sentient and suffering terribly from the way they're mistreated. There was one more.
I think we should go to breakouts, Chaia, if we're going to have any time to do that at all, because we have 30 minutes left.
So why don't we do 20 minutes of breakout and then 10 minutes to come back, and everybody have like a really speed demon note taker to kind of come back. How's that sound?
Yeah, before we do that, could you maybe send us in with a concrete question or a prompt of some kind?
Yes, I'll just tell you what it is. The question is, when you think, how can you think about the way you have thought about the relationship between society and nature? How has that for you changed over time? During your history, within your childhood to your adulthood, as you came of age as a political person, or just simply from reading Bookchin or today's conversation, just for people to reflect on how you have understood what counts for society and nature, and what are the implications of your thoughts, and where do you think they came from? Also, where do you think you've got your understandings of what is society and what is nature?
Okay.
Does somebody from one of the groups want to report back?
Yeah, I guess we can go first. So our group was Dan, Danny, Johanna, Phil, Vanya, Abhishek, and Katie. I think we took your question, what's your history intellectualizing society times the natural world? How's that changed? A lot of us took our formative experiences in youth as a jumping off point for that question. I feel like we really just got going, and I would have loved to hear some more stuff from our group, but our initial thoughts were along the lines of encountering nature as an oppositional force. Well, maybe not oppositional, but encountering the rural as something that's opposed or dichotomously to the urban, and how eye-opening that can be, and trying to think through the ways in which modern industrial society has imposed itself on the natural world. And one of my favorite takes was from Katie, who talked about the way in America, particularly, the white middle class conception of nature is as a source of recreation and just something that exists out there, compartmentalized, kept separate from our lived realities, as just for hiking, or walking, or looking at a pretty mountain and then going back home to your cul-de-sac. So that was a little bit of what we talked about in our group, early childhood experiences, trying to think through the urban versus the rural, as well as the ways in which contemporary middle bourgeois society tries to intellectually separate us from nature, and tries to build mental barriers as well as physical barriers between ourselves and first nature. So I think that's a fair representation of what we talked about.
How about my group? Were we 6 groups or 5 groups, Blair?
I think it was 6 or possibly 7.
Okay, so you should probably
want someone else to jump in.
Yeah.
Okay, I can do that for our group. So we were Zakai, Thomas, Axel, Noel, Bree, Erin, Nori, myself, and talked a lot about sort of the relationship between humans and nature, our conception of that relationship, how that's changed over time. The idea of the self is dynamic and evolving, always becoming and therefore being de facto part of a natural process. Korean natural farming was brought in, I think, based on Noel's perspective and experience with that, our connection to the soil, how most of our bodies are bacteria, not human cells, how trees and animals communicate, kind of miracle mycelium and microbes. We also discussed disability liberation, animal liberation, how the separation of humans and nature versus that being more of a continuum has been exacerbated through the imposition of social models of disability as an attempt for such forms of oppression to further alienate us from nature. A question was asked about, I think by Thomas, about Buddhism, meditation, and the sort of connection to nature notion of impermanence, and whether Bookchin had sort of addressed any of this in his body of work and writing, connection between sort of Buddhist philosophy and thinking, social ecology. I think it was Erin who talked about growing up in a rich natural environment of the Pacific Northwest, where a community really valued its relationship with nature, and how we all experience sort of changes in our mood or mental health in nature and weather, and demonstrating a tangible connection in that way. And then lastly, I think it was Nori who brought up dialectics as a mode of thinking that isn't individual. I'm sorry if I'm crediting this to the wrong person. And how dialogues and a lot of political philosophy, especially that developed outside of the Western tradition, it included, people writing back and forth, exchanging and developing their ideas in that way. And so alienation from nature and also from other humans, that there may be a connection there out of that specific practice.
Since we have 4 minutes, I'm wondering, can people stay a little longer? It's so weird. If we were all in a land-based place together, we could just all decide, yeah, we'll go a couple minutes over, but we're not. So it's weird to ask that question. We have 4 minutes and we have several more groups to go.
I think we can go over a little bit. I mean, folks are coming and going as they need to. I just put a reminder that the next session starts at 1:30. So if people do have to leave sharply, we're going to have the Building Dual Power course with the Symbiosis folks, with Kelly, Mason, and Katie. So yeah, maybe we could.
It's going to be really good. You have to go.
Mariella, you want to do our group next?
Sure. So Blair and Mick, Sasha, McSullen, Kelly, and Lily were in our group. And we spent kind of the first part of our time together talking about really beautiful and powerful encounters with the vastness of more non-binary possibilities within the, I think, maybe philosophical or spiritual frameworks of the different ways that they related to the relationships between society and nature. So I think, Sasha, were you the one who worked with animal rights activism, or who? I forget who it was, but getting into that around middle school and high school, and discovering more problematic aspects of that work around eco-fascism and sexism, racism, humans are the disease. Lily had some really beautiful things to say about her kind of spiritual background and Judaism and radicalism in religion. For instance, in ancient texts, there's more than 2 genders. And Blair shared a really interesting high school experience having to do with the biologizing of homosexuality and how bisexual activists kind of cracked open or cracked through that kind of thinking. And we talked a little bit more about essentialism in the COVID era, or like languages and thinking of around essentialism versus or relating to systemic racist oppression. And he shared an article in the chat that everyone can find for the general group. And then Magsalan brought up a really good question about the noble savage. And that's where I kind of got lost in the answer and didn't take very good notes. So if anybody from our group has anything to share about that, that'd be awesome. But yeah, thanks. Let me know if I missed anything.
Who hasn't chimed in yet? I can just jump in.
I'll go ahead and... Oh. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry, Alex. Thank you. So our group was Max, Seth, Ginny, Alexis, Frank, and Ashley. I think Steve wasn't there. Max is from Rhode Island, Seth from Melbourne, Ginny, Canada, Alexis from Indiana. I'm from Ohio. Frank is from the Philippines, and Ashley's from Boston. We ended up, the beginning of our conversation was talking about, Alexis and I are both from Midwest, US. And so we both grew up with very right-wing parents, right-wing environment. At least for me, a lot of people in my school, it's just like kind of where we grew up. So that was just an interesting conversation of our movement from, at least for me, any kind of ecological type of ideas I had were definitely shunned out of me, I guess. But yeah, that was interesting that we both shared that. Frank talked about how he grew up Catholic, and then got started in activism in the 70s and things like that. And then a couple of people, I think, in our group, at least Max, I believe, talked about Buddhism as well, and that how Buddhism really shaped their ecological understandings. But where we really ended up focusing on, I think, was especially Ashley was just really frustrated with the conversation in general, because we all are nature, and just to have to talk about first nature, second nature, into it is the language is limiting, I think, because the name that Bookchin gave for first nature and second nature, I think even he might have been a little frustrated with the limiting language that brings. And so we just talked about the emergence into the free nature, and how Buddhism relate to that, the oneness, the progress to realizing the dualism between the first nature and second nature so that we can move beyond it. And I think that was all of our conversation.
I can go for my group. So our group was Joe, me, Laura, Ahmed, Lemmy, Mike, Nick, and Mason. I think I may have gotten names wrong. But just broadly, a lot of our conversation was focused on how do we think about oppression of or exploitation of non-humans, and then domination and oppression within human society. And for many of us, we had a kind of background within animal liberation, animal rights, veganism, and for a time that was kind of separate. And then it was kind of, especially I think it was Laura who brought this up, like how do we bring these things together? How do we think about them? And kind of thinking about the problems within kind of animal liberation and veganism, the kind of toxic aspects that can be there, as well as within the kind of humanist or anthropocentric left, what are the kind of problems there, and thinking about the way that social ecology can be really helpful in kind of getting us to think about the origins and the connections of domination, exploitation, etc. And then also, I think it was Ahmed who brought up, again, the way in which first nature and second nature are both nature and they both belong, and how kind of useful that idea is. And then I think Joe was asking a question about how do we define society? Like, do non-human animals have society? And Mason kind of gave us a good kind of definition from Bookchin on what society means and how that applies. Yeah, I think that's a kind of decent overview, hopefully.
All I can report for our group, it was a very diverse and interesting group. We had Chaia, Apurva, Tamara from Slovenia, Brian Tucker, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your names wrong, mispronouncing them, Joshua, I think, Matt, Jorge from Mexico, and Jeff. And then we started talking about our personal experience and our relationship with nature growing up. And one thing that stood out, I believe, for me, was that most of us had a sense of domination. Apurva talked about there's always been this hierarchical sense of humanity dominating nature, but also, as some of us have grown up with Buddhism, I believe Joshua said that, and growing up with Buddhism, and there's always been this sense that something was wrong, or that this interconnection was possible and existed. Tamara talked about her experience as an economist and working for a neoliberal corporation and how that has changed. And then we finished talking about Bookchin and duality and the sense of non-duality and how we should think about what role our humanity to play. Chaia said that, brought that question up, and that we have the power to create and the power to destroy as humanity, and how we have to have political power in order to drive humanity's potential into creating a free and ecological society. So I guess that sums it up. If anybody wants to pop up and say something.
That's good.
I would maybe go for our group. So I think like kind of halfway through we realized nobody was taking notes. So that's going to make it a little bit more difficult. But we had a pretty interesting discussion. It actually started, I think, with Liana, who now has 4 ducks. 2 of them were born, I think, in the last 30 minutes. So that was kind of cool. You could hear that, seeing nature happen. And I am terrible with names. So 1 second. Then we had one participant talk about Katie talk about how she growing up she had felt like she didn't feel like she was really in contact with nature, and she didn't know if that was a good or a bad thing. We also talked about how that's actually okay, like depending, like your own relationship with nature is not something you have to feel guilty about. We also then, I think Mo or Peter talked about how nature kind of connects us all, and when one of us is hurt in nature, and also if we are hurting nature ourselves or our fellow beings or our environment, that that actually comes back to us. And then talked about how like the news, the reason it's so terrible reading the news is because there's so many things that you can't do anything about. And every piece of pain is something that you can kind of relate and empathize to. And then, see, I think Gary said he was from Dallas. Victoria, I can't remember. I think she said we had some internet problems. I can't remember. Someone also mentioned growing up and then their family being really supportive of paganism. And then outside of that, we just talked maybe a little bit about art and how we're not outside of nature as well. So things that we create are not necessarily unnatural, even though there might be sort of an unconscious bias, I think, a lot in left-wing movements about saying, yeah, buildings and everything that humans make is unnatural, when really it's like, well, hey, it's representative of, or maybe it's, if it's useful for us, then what is natural, unnatural. I hope that covered most of what we talked about. Yeah.
Is that the last group? Maybe I'll close this out by saying just one observation that's really interesting, that I think Eastern religion came up a lot in a lot of the groups. And Bookchin was really intrigued by religion, and he saw in most religions a lot of utopian aspirations. He was a very secular, he was ethnically Jewish, but a secular Jew, and he really was fascinated and interested in that so many of humanitarian and ecological utopian longings are often expressed in both Eastern and Western religions. And he found that, philosophy, in his attempt to develop a philosophy, was to really try to tap into that very similar utopian longing that often, again, surfaces in religion. And he wanted to make it secular so that it would be as general as possible and would speak to as many people as possible as a political philosophy. But he had a lot of respect for religions and people. He had a nun with him while he was dying, which was so surprising to me, who sang to him. And he took a lot of comfort in her Catholicism. It's fascinating. Emphasis on love and loving thy neighbor, and it's all kind of utopian stuff.
So should we close it out, Chaia? And thank you so much for giving us so much to chew on to start off today. Thanks everyone for sticking with it. This is definitely like a very dense, abstract session. But I think we both Chaia and in our groups did a good job of breaking it down into how it relates to our contemporary issues and struggles, which will be the topic of our next session, starting in an hour and a half or a little bit less than that at 1:30 Eastern, building dual power and revolutionary movements. So how do we put all this into action? How are groups putting it into action? So go outside.
Do people want a quick video of the ducks?
Oh yeah.
Okay, here. I think I can do it the other way where
Spotlighted your videos.
Boom. Okay, here you go. Here's the duck incubator. And here they are. And they're chirping. And a couple of them were born early this morning, so they've lucked out. And then the ones that were just born are still not lucky.
Is that Liana?
Yes. Hi, Chaia.
I know you.
This is what I've been up to, and this one is gonna be born soon, and that one maybe tomorrow.
Wow. Thank you.
You're welcome. Everyone have a great lunch.
Okay.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everybody in a little bit.